I'm Karolina Szczur, and I'm even pronouncing my surname in an English way, which is really awkward. Anyway, I'm from Poland and I moved to Melbourne like 7 months ago. I'm Fox on Twitter to make it easier if you have questions, because 20 minutes is a pretty short amount of time for what I have to say. So if you have any questions, just ping me. And we talked about this already, but I'm one of the organizers for JSConf and CSSConf here. And it's going to be November 30th through December 2nd with Decompress. And we have tickets that we're selling and we're looking for speakers. So again, just to reinforce that, if you have any questions or want to be a speaker, don't have experience speaking, or whatever you might think about these events, just reach out to me or Jordan or Miffy, because we would like you to be there and we think it will be great. So I have a lot of things to talk about in only 20 minutes, so just to let you know what I'm going to talk about, a quick overview of this talk. I want to talk about PostCSS mostly. Who heard of PostCSS? So majority of people. Who uses it on like daily basis? Okay, less people. Cool. Well, I guess that will make it a little bit interesting. So we'll be talking about PostCSS and how it relates to front-end architecture and how to build good front-end architectures in general. So just to reflect a little bit on how the web looks today, a little bit of history. HTML was introduced 25 years ago by Tim Berners-Lee, which is a fair amount of time. And CSS didn't come to life till 5 years later, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about, because like just thinking about imagining a web without any styles whatsoever, just fully dependent on some weird obscure browsers that have weird rendering quirks, completely non-cohesive, non-unified, weird web as it was for 5 years. And also, interesting thing, if you want to look up how CSS came to life and what languages almost became CSS, there's a really interesting article in the bottom of the slide that I really recommend to like figure out how obscure CSS was before it actually became what it is right now. So according to HTTP Archive, CSS is the 4th biggest resource on given website or application. Of course, images are first, 1.5 meg, scripts 400 kilobytes, video 260, and CSS 77 kilobytes, and that's like the stats that they have. So it's not very significant in size, but when you think about it, the style sheets are the building block of the web, and they carry through the metaphor of visual design into the living, changing web. So I think that's like actually a big role to have as a language. And we are able to do a lot of things with CSS and frontend in general that we didn't think about doing years ago. And the current frontend landscape is very fascinating and very diverse and also very overwhelming. So last year, Ashley Nolan had this survey called The State of Frontend, Frontend Tooling, I believe. And there are at least 2,000 results, which, you know, in statistics, it's completely irrelevant, but I guess it gives us a little bit of a quite comprehensive landscape of what frontend is and how frontend developers work. So according to these results, Sass is obviously the preprocessor of choice. A few people heard of Post and Rework, but it's a fairly slow adoption line, and it's only a few people that really actually heard about it and used it. But it's important to note the context of that survey, because that was done when those projects like basically were released, so that's actually no surprise. A lot of people rely on Grunt and Gulp as task runners. NPM is slowly creeping up. jQuery is still the preferred JavaScript framework of choice. That's what people feel comfortable with. Very few people test or bundle JavaScript, which to me is bizarre, but that's a thing that was a learning from the survey. So that kind of gives us more context for what the state of frontend is. So alongside with community efforts like that, just surveys, we had a lot of standards happening in the last 10 years or so. We have responsive web, so we have flexible, adaptable layouts and images as well. We have scoped CSS with CSS modules, which is great, and it's something that's definitely a problem we have to solve when we have like really uncontrollably growing web. And we have variables and feature queries and many, many more features that are still in development. So just to have a little bit of background to talking about transforming CSS, which is the main topic of this talk. So there are many ways to do so. And there are different processors targeted towards different environments, such as Node or Ruby or Rails. They work at varying speeds as well, depending on the parser that backs it. And they have a lot of different features as well. So processing was born out of the need to have variables and out of the need to have mixins, which means that we want to build more resilient, reusable, and scalable systems. Like that's something that we really wanted to do, so we needed a language that would provide the platform to do so, and CSS was too constrained to do so. So we, in 2000s, we created Sass, Less, and Stylus. I think that's actually the right order that they were launched. And these processes gave us exactly that, variables and mixins and just a lot of possibility functions as well, extending the possibility of CSS. But I think when we think about any tooling, and it can be front-end design and can be back-end as well, in the ever-changing landscape of that technological advancement, unfortunately, we have that tendency to really like jump on the bandwagon and be like, oh, this new cool framework, I'm on it. But we don't really reflect on that, and we don't really have the necessary insight or discovery that should come into that decision. We just kind of wing it and go with it. Because I feel like after all, no one wants to like work on a legacy, old, dated monolith. Like we just want to use new cool stuff for some reason. And that approach, I feel like, led us to something quite dangerous. So misunderstanding what pre-processing and post-processing means. So as previous projects matured, like Sass, Less, and Stylus, there was a little bit of experimentation going on among developers. And one of the first projects that were, I think, coined processing or post-processing was Rework, written by a very prolific Node developer, TJ Holloway-Chuck, who's absolutely amazing, living somewhere in the forest in Canada, I think, just smashing code. So he wrote Rework, and what Rework does is accepts CSS and produces an abstract syntax tree, and then provides an API to modify that tree, and then feeds it back to CSS file. So you can modify that CSS with external plugins, which is pretty great. So that project doesn't seem to be in active development anymore because TJ just likes to abandon stuff and move on to more interesting things, like writing programming languages. But it was definitely a base for a new project called Myth that's currently maintained by Segment.io, a company based off SF. And at least it was an inspiration post-CSS. And Myth is actually something that's built on top of Rework and provides you a way to use future syntax that eventually will drop in browsers. And it's a very like nifty, small tool that lets you do just that. So it was really great to see those post processes, as they were coined, surface, and they offered us future-proof syntax, which was really exciting for everyone. And technically, that allows us to write future-proof CSS with some add-ons, and eventually that will just be in browsers. But again, that's where the post-processing and pre-processing confusion comes into play. Because when you think about it, writing future-proof CSS is not actually CSS, because it's not in browsers right now, so it's not CSS. It's just another way of patching the things that we want to see. So especially in Post, you can basically write Sass in Post, which is like a really weird concept, and it just confuses people a lot. You can basically use plugins to mimic Sass functionality, like write variables in the same way, write mixins and extends, and have all of that functionality. So we're used to call it post-processing, but actually it's something different. So all of those tools like Sass, Less, Stylus, Myth, and PostCSS are just processors because they empower us to use features that don't exist. And it doesn't matter if they land in browsers or not. Like, it's just processing CSS, language that already exists and is fully supported. And I feel like post-processing is something that slightly should be understood in a different way. Because post-processing relies, like even looking at the name, post means after. So processing is an umbrella for automation tasks that run on CSS for production deploy-ready code, right? So that's something like prefixing, something like minification, critical path, modularization, imports, converting rems to pixels. That's post-processing, not pre-processing. So I think it's really important to draw that difference in between pre-processing and post-processing. All of the tools that we're talking about, Sass and whatnot, and post as well, are processors. And post-processing is just automation tasks for mostly performance reasons, usually. So we kind of dabbled in pre-processing and post-processing world, but what is post-CSS? So post-CSS is basically the same as real work. It's a CSS parser, an API built on top of Node.js, because that's what you build, obviously. Created by the author of Autoprefixer. And it's a tool that will allow you building transformation systems through external modules. And it's a fairly new project, I think a year old. Well, I guess that's old in our world right now. But it's been published in January 2015, I think. And right now it's at 100,000 downloads per day, which I think is pretty significant. So yeah, it works the same way as real work. It takes CSS, parses it into abstract syntax tree, and then you can use whatever you want to do whatever you want, and then it will take the string and parse it back to CSS. So what happens in the meantime, post-CSS doesn't care. And it has quite an extensive catalog of modules, 200, I think, right now. And they do different things like different syntax, linting, image processing, more global generic tasks. So, and they also strongly encourage you to write your own plugins. Like, it's actually really quite straightforward if you have some JavaScript knowledge to do that. And I think it's quite powerful because you can do things like variables and like future-proof syntax and whatnot, but you can also do stats and CSS if you wanted to. So it's actually like a really powerful abstraction that you can use for whatever you want. But I feel like post is really confusing for a lot of people. So people think that post guarantees you future-proof syntax. It doesn't. There was a slight confusion between two projects, which is Post and CSS Next. And for a long, long time, people thought that they were the same, but they're just competing open source projects. It doesn't really matter, and everyone was confused. And eventually, people who are working on CSS Next decided that that plugin that actually guarantees future-proof syntax should be a part of the Post-CSS ecosystem. So they renamed it to Post-CSS, CSS Next. So there is no confusion of what does what. Because again, Post is just an abstraction. Like, it abstracts your CSS. It doesn't do anything else. Everything else is done by modules or yourself, whatever you write. So yeah, that provides only abstraction and API. And CSS Next actually gives you things like nesting, advanced pseudo classes, variables, custom media queries, and all the stuff that's currently worked on by W3C on a spec. Unfortunately, I guess we'll land in browsers in a couple of years if we are lucky. And yeah, and Post-CSS works with many build processes. I think they made it basically compatible with everything. So it'll run with Grunt, Gulp, Webpack, NPM scripts. It can be used with React through inline sliding. It has an API, so you can use it with basically anything. And just to kind of show how easy it is, I made a little project, which is just like totally experimentation, just whipping code on a lunch break kind of thing, but just to picture how easy it is to set it up. Come on, Chrome. Okay, so this is gonna be tricky because I really cannot say. But yeah, so this is the project I've done. It's open source, defoxes / post-CSS npm boilerplate, I think. Yeah. So the way it works, and I really can't do this, can I? Source. Okay. So I just created 3 CSS files just to show it off. Write some future-proof code. I think future-proof is just great. just going to use it all the time. Custom media queries, some nesting, and you nest in with cssnext with ampersand, so that's kind of a weird thing, but that's how they do it. Define some variables which are written exactly like Sass variables. And imported all of this in main CSS. That's pretty cool. Basically writing Sass. Wow, cool. Cool to see my face. Yeah, and to make it easier, so I come from Node background, so like npm scripts is like the default for me. I don't really like bespoke build setups, so I used npm scripts. So the way I did it is included all the config for PostCSS here. So that basically says use these three modules, PostCSS, cssnext, simple variables, which basically mimics Sass variables, and PostCSS import. Take this file, output to this file, accept local plugins from Node modules, and these are the browser specs for autoprefixer, because cssnext has it by default. So this is just a JSON file that I will feed here in npm scripts. And yeah, and it's really straightforward, so it's really hard to read. On change, it watches for changes in CSS files and runs the build. Build CSS, run minify, run cleanup. Yeah, post CSS, true CSS Nano, which is like an optimization tool. Go to main min CSS because performance, and I just had to do it for some arbitrary reason. But yeah, it's just really straightforward, even for a person who is like not really super backend oriented. So I just felt like, you know, like if I can do it in 5 minutes, that probably means that it's quite simple to set up. So yeah, that project is there, and if you want to look like how to like, I don't know, super simple setup with Post to like make a silly website, that probably will be like a good place to go to and just experiment and extend. Of course, this is not like the most performant setup, the most performant way to do CSS, and probably there are like 10 times, you know, smarter methods to write npm scripts, but it's pretty good as a starting point just for experimentation sake. Is this gonna work? No? Fine then. All right, so we talked a little bit about what Post is as a tool, and I really want to give you kind of a little bit of insight on what would be the advantages and disadvantages of using it, because obviously, as for every single tool, there are many. So PostCSS is more comprehensible and beginner friendly, and that is because it's basically almost writing pure CSS, and that automatically becomes more readable, especially for people who have less front-end knowledge. So people who are starting, or people who are back-end developers making changes in the front-end. So you can make Post really complicated. Like basically humans have this magical ability to make everything complicated, so you can make it really complicated if you want to. But like true, like mimicking Sass behavior and whatnot. But by default, it's less logic in the code, and that equals something that's easier to contribute to and more reasonable to grasp for our collaborators, which I think is a really great thing. PostCSS is future-proof. So in theory, one day, all of those specs magically work in browsers, like actual stable versions, and you are able to drop PostCSS and magically everything works. Or maybe not everything, not the actual optimization part, like minification and autoprefix and whatnot, because that's a different story. But the whole syntax on its own just works. So that's kind of like a magical moment to look forward to. I don't know if it will actually happen, but we can hope for it. I just think it's a really great concept to think about. And because we are programmers and we love thinking about numbers and how fast everything is, especially in Node realm, PostCSS is faster. So benchmarking is kind of weird because it runs in a clean environment and it kind of ignores everything else. So like benchmarks to me are a little bit out of place. But if you look at benchmarks, PostCSS is 28 times faster than Ruby Sass. And I know there's libsass, hey Miffy. But still, like you know, in some contexts, it can be way faster. Of course, it depends on your architecture and what build processes you are using, and like 10 other things. but in technicality, it's faster because it's JavaScript. And it is feature rich. So if you're thinking about pre-processing in traditional sense, so Sass and the like, it only allows you to do stuff like mixins and variables and nesting and whatnot. So it doesn't offer you this whole realm of optimization stuff for deployment. So image optimization, splitting up files, and being all smart and crafty about, you know, performance issues, accessibility issues as well. And Post has that. So it's one tool that offers you a whole ecosystem of tools that you can kind of bundle up and create something that you really need. But like, it just can be so great. So first of all, CSS isn't a programming language, and PostCSS aspires to be something in the CSS world that's an equivalent of Babel in the JavaScript world. And it's really cool to think that it's possible, but it's not, because CSS isn't a programming language, and some workarounds are simply not possible. Like we just can't implement it. And there has been some problems in that project surrounding like calculations and whatnot, just because of that. And I feel like style sheets are intentionally sparse, and their whole purpose is a little bit different in programming language. Like it's a presentation layer, so we shouldn't really have logical flows. Although it's kind of cool to have code, like in current landscape of devices, for example, have the supports, add supports stuff to figure out some logic. So I don't know, it's kind of like a weird space, but yeah, CSS isn't a programming language, so Post can't really fight with that. And we talked a lot about future-proofing, and sure, like it's a cool claim to make, like we're future-proof. Oh my God, we can like drop everything and like just everything works. But there's a little gimmick to that. So one, it takes a lot of time for spec to mature, and it can go from like proposal to draft and then to implementation. It takes forever. So it's a really, really long curve for something to actually ship to the browser. I don't know if a lot of you done browser work or realized how like much work does that entail, but it's a very long process. And sometimes specifications will change, and I think the best example for that is Flexbox, which basically changed like 100%, and people are still kind of like fiddling, oh, which syntax is right? I don't know, or should we support this or that one? And it's just still confusing for some people. And that brings difficulty to people who create Post and the users as well, because what is the decision making behind that? You have two different syntaxes. Are you gonna like support both of them in Post, or are you gonna just roll with the newest one and let just users kind of freak out? So it's a kind of difficult situation to manage, and it's a consideration for people who are running projects similar to Post and Myth. And a lot of people like to say like, oh, it's so easy to port because like it's pure CSS and you know it's JavaScript, it's all great. We can just port it no problem. But honestly, you can't really make that claim because you don't know what people are working on, and you don't know what their infrastructure is like. You don't know what their backend is like. So it might be a huge mess of a code base that's like, I don't know, whatever amount of years old, and it might have some legacy code. And it might be actually really painful to implement PostCSS. So claiming that like, you know, like this particle tour is very portable is cool, but it usually works well in clean environments like setting up new projects and whatnot. And with older code bases, you're like, oh my God, what did I get myself into? And you're just banging your head against the desk. So yeah, it might be portable for some projects, especially smaller ones, but for bigger projects, it might be actually a huge architectural change. And talking about architecture, I really love architecture and thinking about architecture in general in terms of design and front end. So I really wanted to touch on that, especially that I feel like Post, in a way it's engineered, kind of empowers thinking about that. So preprocessors create an abstraction on top of CSS. And it can significantly increase complexity in a project because like just throwing some functions, some extends, like, oh my God, it's so fancy. I wrote this super smart code. Everyone will totally understand it, and it does this one cool thing that's like completely unnecessary. So it can get out of hand very quickly, and it can become very incomprehensible, even for experienced people. Like you go into a code base like 6 months later and you're like, I just can't understand what's happening here. Because of the output of processing is so out of our sight, we're prone to forget that there's a performance footprint to it, and there's also user experience bottlenecks that may arise from our decisions that we are kind of making mindlessly as we work. So these tools, all of the processing tools, not only Post, not only Sass, all of them, can be both a blessing and a curse, distracting us from creating lasting architectures and like really meaningful user experiences. So Post might be a good tool for creating a lasting architecture. It might be not, but I feel like there is something way bigger, like way bigger concept than that one particular tool that I think is cool. And that's a more abstract, overarching strategy. So a set of working agreements that promote reasonable standards for working. Because like technological choices are important, sure, like, and we really like to obsess about them. But it's far easier to back up from a back engineering decision that reinvent working culture that's just broken. So frontend was historically treated as something like second-class citizen, kind of awkwardly placed in between design and backend and software engineering. And systems thinking was primarily associated with design, with backend, infrastructure as well, DevOps, like serious disciplines. Somehow it felt like, you know, like architecture is a thing that we should use with those sections of tech world, not frontend. But I feel like frontend right now, especially right now when it's growing so hard and so fast, it deserves the same treatment. So how do we define and understand what front-end architecture is? What does it entail? So to me, it's a set of rules, suggestions for technical implementation, and guidelines of like how to work together, basically. So if you were a systems designer or like a front-end architect, whatever that means, because we like titles, it's someone who weighs on benefits and drawbacks of a given technology that you're supposed to use or you want to use and propose suitable solutions for that. And that should go hand in hand with the organization goals, whatever they are, and comply with predefined guidelines. So what are these guidelines? Extensible, reusable, comprehensible, standardized, and enforced. So extensible. Architectures and code should be approachable without any enormous learning curve, so it doesn't take you like a week to like figure out what's what. Or, well, maybe a week is reasonable, but 2 weeks. I don't know, it's an arbitrary number, but it shouldn't take you a lot of time to learn it. And many developers will be maintaining code bases. They just come and go. It might be you in 6 months, so building upon them. So it's really, really, really important that those systems can be extended into bigger systems so you can easily create new components and you can understand what's happening. And reusable, because we don't want to create more code. We just want to use what's already there. So rules should be decoupled enough, and so you can form building blocks from them and build interfaces from them. Because you don't want to be solving the same problems over and over. You just want a solution that's reusable so you can apply them for solving new problems. And comprehensible. So even a fairly, you know, a person who's a beginner in the front-end world, or maybe someone who's just like really willing to contribute, like a marketing person, or a designer who doesn't know how to code, or a backend developer who, I don't know, by proxy has to do front-end. Like, we want those people to be able to contribute. So, you know, if you make your code super bespoke and super complicated, it's not going to empower them to do anything. So I feel like trying to be clever and reinvent the wheel is kind of a bad pattern to do. So what we want to aim for is comprehensible code and predictable code. So when you go and edit something and they're like, oh my God, this other thing exploded, I wonder why. We want it to be comprehensible. And most importantly, we want it to be standardized and enforced. So documentation is key in building architecture and educating other people. If you don't have documentation, it's all pointless. So you can have all the standards and the most pristine CSS, HTML, JavaScript, whatever, it doesn't matter. Because if people don't know how to contribute and what is the standard, and if it is enforced, it will all be pointless because there will be no responsibility, there will be no guidelines for creating that cohesiveness of a system. So these are kind of like overarching rules or concepts that I like to think about. But there are some actual technical solutions that you can implement to make that happen, which is a design system, coding principles, tech stack, and testing strategy. And you could probably elaborate and have more, but I think these are like a good starting point. So design system, and this is like a topic for another discussion that we don't have time for, but it can be named in a different way. So you can say design system pattern library or a style guide, which I think are just like kind of thrown around simultaneously and no one knows what's what and people are really confused. But what it is a system that's usually is created by the design team and front-end team together, or maybe design team on its own, which is maintained in a living document. It's basically a collection of small atoms, little elements like buttons or lists or typography, and some variables like I don't know, font sizes or colors that are reusable for the system. And then coding principles. So that's kind of abstract. So how do you write CSS? Well, these are our classes. We use BAM. This is the way we do modules. This is we do specificity. This is the way we do declaration order, because maybe we want to have like display first and then fonts and then color and then trivia. Like, these are really important decisions, and you kind of, if you're working on real systems, especially in bigger teams, it's really important for you to have to refer to. And then there's technological stack, so like which preprocessors I'm going to use, or processors. Am I going to use Post or maybe Sass? What's relevant to my use case? Which JavaScript libraries, dependency management, build systems, and deployment, and the list goes on because technology is huge. And then testing strategies, so performance, accessibility, visual regressions, unit testings for JavaScript, and manual testing, and the list goes on again. But these are the ways that you can leverage, the process that you can leverage to create lasting architectures. And I think Post actually fits in that mindset quite nicely, because it makes you conscious of what decisions you are making. So the tool itself is just, you know, a translator. Like, it doesn't really do anything else. So you have to make those conscious decisions to include modules that you really need. Like, you just want go and npm install all the Post modules because I feel it. I'm really feeling it today. So yeah, it just really forces you to be conscious about your decisions, and I think that's something that we really should strive for. And I think that kind of moves us toward that front architecture thinking that I really, really would love to see more than it's just in just companies that are, you know, like have the bandwidth to like have teams dedicated to design systems and whatnot. So yeah, I'm way over time, and I have more to say, but I don't have more time. So if you have any questions, maybe I'll think like one or two and then run away very quickly. Yeah, thank you.